This tiny little box is rocking an Intel Raptor Lake CPU with 14 cores, DDR5 memory, enough NVMe to keep just about anyone happy, dual 10 gigabit networking, and a Desktop PCI Express slot, all for $679. It's the mini PC of my dreams, and it might just make the perfect PC or Homelab box for you too. Let's dive in. Today's video is brought to you by me. Check out craftcomputing.store for all of my official merch and help fund the content that you enjoy watching here on the channel. From custom laser-engraved pint glasses to coasters and whiskey stones, and even our brand new double-wall insulated coffee tumblers, all of my merch is designed 100% in-house and made to order by me. I'm also now offering flat-rate international shipping to 23 different countries, and if you live in the continental US, free shipping on orders over $35. So, what are you waiting for? Head on over to craftcomputing.store and start drinking like a pro. Cheers, everyone. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. So, this is the Minisforum MS-01, and if you haven't already heard about it, you are in for a treat today. This is one of the most requested and talked about PCs in my comment section over the last couple of months, and for some very good reasons. Before we get into it, a huge thanks to Minisforum for sending over the MS-01 for this review, as well as 32 gigabytes of DDR5 and a 1TB NVMe drive. Like all reviews on this channel, no money changed hands. Minisforum has no input over the production of this video, nor will they have the opportunity to see it before it goes live on YouTube. With disclosures out of the way, inside of this we've got an Intel Raptor Lake i9-13900H CPU with 14 cores and 20 threads, thanks to its 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. For memory, we've got 32 gigabytes of crucial DDR5 running at 5200 megatransfers per second, with up to 64 gigabytes supported inside the system. If you've shopped for mini PCs in the past, you know that's where the spec sheet tends to stop. But we are far from done talking. Checking out the back of the PC, there are a couple USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, an HDMI 2.0 for video, and now is where it starts getting interesting, with a pair of USB 4 ports, each supporting up to 40 gigabit per second for networking, high-speed storage, or external Thunderbolt GPUs. 2.5 gigabit Ethernet is quickly becoming the new standard, and here we've got a couple of 2.5 gigabit ports thanks to the Intel i226 network controllers on board. And normally, I'd be pretty excited about a pair of 2.5 gigabit ports, but those are easily overshadowed by the real star of today's show, with a pair of Intel X710 10 gigabit network ports to round out the I/O. Moving inside of the MS-01, believe it or not, it starts looking even better. For storage, there are 3 M.2 NVMe slots, with 2 of them supporting 22 110 length drives. The third slot can also be adapted over to a 2.5-inch U.2 NVMe drive, opening up your options for drives with massive capacities. Last but not least, there's actually a Desktop PCI Express expansion slot inside of here. Now, this is a bit of a good news, bad news situation. As while it's great to have this kind of expansion potential, you are a little limited on what you can actually do with it. The port is a full X16 slot, but it is limited to just 8 lanes. That's not to worry though, as this is actually wired to the PCI Express Gen 5 inside of the CPU, meaning bandwidth will never be a problem with 256 gigabit per second of bandwidth available here. That is a ton of features crammed into such a small box, and it's pretty easy to see why people have been excited about this hitting the market, specifically for Homelab use. One of the reasons I spent a full week testing out Proxmox on Intel's hybrid mobile CPUs recently was because I knew this review was coming down the pipe, and wanted to fully flesh out what virtualization would look like running on something like Intel's i9-13900H. If you want a full deep dive on Proxmox running on Big Little architecture, I'll leave those links down in the video description. But let's just say that performance is incredible when properly configured. Now obviously, there's a whole bunch of expansion potential inside the MS-01, and overall, I'd say that Minisforum's nailed the execution of it all. The i9-13900H has a total of 28 PCI Express lanes available to it, but they're not all Gen 5 speed, and there are some specific limitations on how they can be used by devices downstream. First off, let's break down exactly what we're working with here. The 28 lanes are broken down into 8 PCI Express Gen 5 lanes, 8 PCI Express Gen 4 lanes, and 12 PCI Express Gen 3 lanes. The 8 lanes of Gen 5 were intended to be used with an onboard graphics card in a laptop, but cannot be split up or bifurcated to support multiple devices. That's important for a couple reasons. One, the only logical place to put the Gen 5 lanes is into the Desktop PCI Express slot, as wiring up the Gen 5 lanes to, say, a single M.2 slot would be an absolute waste of resources. Secondly, it means you can't install additional NVMe cards via the X8 slot if they require bifurcation, as that's not supported by the CPU platform on that port. Installing a single NVMe drive would absolutely work, but you can't add in cards like this that are designed to hold multiple PCI Express cards unless the expansion card itself contains its own PCI Express switch. Moving down the chain, there are also 8 PCI Express Gen 4 lanes broken up into 2 sets of 4. One of these is wired directly to the primary M.2 slot for Gen 4x4 NVMe, giving you the full bandwidth potential for that drive. The other 4 lanes are wired internally to a pair of Intel X710 10GB network controllers. Both the Gen 5 and the Gen 4 lanes are wired directly to the CPU and do not share bandwidth with any other devices inside of the PC. Of note as well, the pair of USB 4 are also wired directly to the CPU, and each port is capable of 40 gigabit per second transfers, again, without sharing bandwidth with any other devices. Those paying attention might have noticed I didn't mention the other 2 M.2 NVMe slots yet, and that's because those are wired into the PCH chipset lanes via PCI Express Gen 3. The second M.2 slot is a Gen 3x4 and should be good for speeds up to 3,500 megabytes per second. The third M.2 slot is only wired up to a Gen 3x2 lane, which is going to top out at around 1,000 megabytes per second. The Wi-Fi and each of the Intel i226 2.5 gigabit network controllers also each get a Gen 3x1 lane wired in, which is more than enough to handle traffic on those devices as well. Now, all of the Gen 3 lanes are connected to the chipset, and that has a dedicated 8x lanes of OPIO, otherwise known as PCI Express Gen 4, to connect up to the 13900H die proper, which means there shouldn't really be any bandwidth limitations between the chipset and the CPU itself, so for all intents and purposes, all of the PCI Express Gen 3 connectivity won't share resources either, but there is some potential for some bottlenecking if you max out everything. Small form factor systems like this often have some serious compromises when it comes to PCI Express connectivity, but I'm actually not disappointed at all with the layout here. We do get access to both a full Gen 4x4 NVMe slot as well as dedicated dual 10 gigabit networking. There are going to be some limitations on local storage speeds with the other 2 M.2 slots, with some pretty hard falloff in performance if you utilize all 3 drives. But if you're using this primarily as an NVMe file server, even the Gen 3x2 slot is going to be more than enough to saturate a single 10 gigabit network line. I also really like the inclusion of a Desktop PCI Express slot, as it adds a host of expansion potential not usually seen in boxes quite this small. With PCI Express Gen 5, 25, 40, or hell, even 100 gigabit per second networking is not out of the question. Though again, you will be limited by storage bandwidth if you want to push network connectivity much beyond 10 gigabit per second. Keep in mind that any high-speed networking or NVMe expansion card will likely need active cooling as well, as the MS-01 has no system fans on that side of the PC. There is a dedicated fan for cooling the DDR5 and the CPU, as well as a fan on the underside to cool your NVMe drives. Also, while the PCI Express slot does support a full 75 watts of power delivery of a true desktop motherboard, I found compatibility with some cards to be hit or miss. Again, if you want to add additional storage via an NVMe expansion card, there's no bifurcation on this slot, so you'll need a card with its own controller. And most likely, those aren't going to fit into this system anyway, with cards limited to being half height and half length. Adding in a video card for workstation use is going to be off the table for most people as well, as all but cards like the RX 6400 or Nvidia's old Quadro SFF cards likely are not going to fit. If there was room enough for a fan solution, I actually considered trying to add in a Tesla P4 or a Tesla T4, but that's obviously a no-go without an active cooler on those. I did try out some of the small form factor cards that I have laying around, and a couple of them refused to even be recognized in the BIOS. While my Pascal-based P1000 worked just fine, the newer Tesla T400 wasn't even seen by the PC, even though the fan on the GPU did spin up when the PC was powered on. Curiously, Minisforum advertises support for GPUs up to, and I quote, the RTX A2000 Mobile, which I have never seen offered for sale from any vendor ever. And I know where to buy some pretty weird shit. It struck me as a bit odd for that recommendation to appear on the MS-01 product page, as that's not exactly a card that NVIDIA made in a desktop form factor. It's typically an add-in card for laptops in an MXM form factor or built directly onto a laptop motherboard. One thing I would have loved to see support for in this system is 2-slot small form factor cards, as that would significantly open up the potential for GPU expansion. Cards like the A2000 and the A4000 Ada SFF would make amazing combos to go along with the 13900H. But as it is, you're likely not going to be using the PCI Express slot much at all, and certainly leaving some potential use cases on the table because of its size and compatibility limitations. Also, thickening up the case just a little bit would actually give you room for a couple of 2.5-inch SSDs, further adding to the storage expandability on the system. So I'd have loved to see the system about 1 inch thicker. So we've got tons of expansion potential, but how well does it actually perform? Jumping into Windows, I did run it through its paces in Cinebench R23, and got a multi-threaded score of 11,938 and a single-threaded score of 1694. Pretty respectable for a CPU that draws only 45 watts of power from the wall after 30 seconds, and more than enough horsepower to drive most Homelabs, whether you want to run services on bare metal, in container, or even virtualized. For comparison's sake, I've been doing some testing on a Xeon 5218 Gold 16-core processor on my test bench for another project, and that managed a score of just 14,750, with single-threaded performance coming in at a painfully slow 841. Now, the 5218 is no speed demon with its Cascade Lake architecture and 3.6 GHz boost clocks, but it does go to show just how much performance is packed into the 13900H. Keep in mind the 5218 was also drawing 130 watts to get that level of performance. While the 13900H does have a listed max TDP of 115 watts, I actually never saw it climb higher than around 70 watts. At that power draw, the P-cores did clock up to 4.5 GHz, with the efficiency cores reaching about 3.1 GHz, and temps peaking at around 76 degrees. However, the turbo mode on the CPU is limited to just 30 seconds, after which the power limit falls to 45 watts, which it can hold so long as there's enough cooling available. At 45 watts, the CPU sat very comfortably at around 67 degrees Celsius, though clock speeds also dropped off significantly. P-cores fell to just 3.2 GHz, while efficiency cores managed just 2.1. Not spectacular, but I also don't think the main use case for this box is going to be 100% utilization 100% of the time. Raptor Lake mobile CPUs shine in more bursty performance scenarios anyway, where clock speeds can reach upwards of 5.4 GHz. However, I never saw clock speeds run faster than 4.5 GHz in my time with the MS-01. The BIOS was set for full turbo performance, but I also didn't see any adjustments for turbo power limits. Now, that's not a huge deal, as again, turbo mode only runs for around 30 seconds at the start of a task anyway. Overall, performance was more than solid, considering we're working with essentially a laptop CPU. Though, I do have a bone to pick here. I wish Intel would allow for turbo unlocking for devices that aren't installed in laptops. The reason Intel limits turbo duration in these mobile CPUs is often because coolers used in Ultrabooks can't sustain 115 watts for more than a few seconds at a time. Meanwhile, the 13900H installed in the MS-01 has a copper-finned heatsink that's 20mm thick with a 60mm blower taking care of airflow. Cooling isn't a problem in this PC, as proven by the 76-degree max temperature I observed while testing. The 13900H also has a T-junction of 100 degrees Celsius, which means there's more than enough thermal headroom to increase performance by 50% if Intel would let us take the leash off this thing. Though I'm pretty sure someone will release a modded BIOS for the MS-01 before too long, as this has drawn plenty of interest from the Homelab and performance communities alike. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I spent nearly a week testing out Proxmox on Intel's hybrid Big Little architecture, partially in preparation for this review, and I'm really glad that I did. As I mentioned in one of those videos, with the Intel microcode package installed, stability was rock solid, and performance automatically scales perfectly between performance and efficiency cores. I tested out the MS-01 and Proxmox by installing 5 Windows Server 2022 virtual machines, each with 4 threads and 4 GB of memory in order to stress this system to the absolute limit. That's all 20 threads from the 13900H made available to the virtual machines at any point in time. Again, I did test out Cinebench R23 running in Windows on bare metal and wanted to compare that score to Windows running in a VM. With all 5 VMs up and running, but only a single VM running Cinebench, we see multi-threaded scores of 5,410 and a single-threaded score of 1,572. That actually lines up with testing I did a couple weeks ago, where Cinebench will use 4 P-cores in the multi-threaded test, giving us almost perfect performance scaling over single-threaded, so long as we stay inside of the 45-watt power limit. Running Cinebench on 2 VMs sees performance drop slightly in each test, as with only 6 performance cores, a couple of the efficiency cores were put to use in the multi-threading testing. Still, solid performance overall though. And finally, stressing every thread possible, I ran Cinebench on all 5 VMs at the same time, and we get an average of 1954, or a combined score of 9774. That is around 19% slower than the theoretical max of 11938 when testing on bare metal. Virtualization does have some overhead costs, but again, keep in mind we're running 5 Windows Server VMs and expecting 100% utilization on a mobile CPU that pulls just 45 watts of power. Also, I don't expect people in the market for a super compact home server like this are going to expect it to run at 100% utilization all the time. Again, Raptor Lake is at its best when you need rapid bursts of performance, not sustained utilization. And burst performance is where most Homelab services tend to find themselves. On top of performance and virtualization, there are some other cool features I didn't even mention yet. As the 13900H has Intel's Iris Xe graphics on board, that means you've got Intel QuickSync support for hardware video encoding built right into this as well. That's important if your Homelab plans include media servers like Plex or Jellyfin, or if you wanted to run an NVR service for recording security camera footage. Intel VTD support is also included for PCI Express pass-through to a virtual machine. That means you could pass through one of the network controllers for dedicated use in a router, or pass through a video card in the PCI Express slot for additional hardware encoding or workstation use. Just keep in mind the limitations and potential compatibility issues I mentioned earlier regarding the Desktop PCIe slot. Overall, if you couldn't tell, I am a huge fan of the Minisforum MS-01. As of the time of filming, the bare bones model with an Intel i9-13900H is selling for $679, though it is worth noting that may be a reduced price, as they quote a retail price of $839. Even at the higher price though, it's competitive with mini PCs equipped with the same CPU, but without the well thought out PCI Express lane distribution or built-in 10 gigabit networking. I have done quite a lot of testing and tinkering with Intel's mobile CPUs in my home lab over the last year, most notably swapping out some of my 16-core Xeon V4 powered systems for a couple of 11th gen Tiger Lake 8-core CPUs, and the results have been absolutely fantastic. Not only is multi-threaded performance basically identical, the single-threaded performance is nearly 2-to-1 in favor of the 11900H chips currently powering my virtual machines. Given the 13900H is nearly 50% faster still, it's safe to say that most Homelabbers are going to be more than happy with the performance found inside of the 13900H. It definitely has some limitations when it comes to local NVMe performance, and you'll still need a dedicated solution for mass storage. But if you're looking for a sub $1,000 PC to power all of your home lab needs, you can do much worse than the Minisforum MS-01. If you're interested in picking up the Minisforum MS-01 for yourself, I will have affiliate links down in the video description. Make sure to go give those a look. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on the social medias at Craft Computing for daily shenanigans like this. And if you like the content you see on the channel and want to help support me in what I do, go on over to craftcomputing.store, pick up one of our fantastic nucleated pint glasses, coasters, or various other accessories, and start drinking like a pro. That's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone. That is such a good beer. Beer for today is from Pfriem Brewing out of Hood River, Oregon. It is their winter ale, clocking in at 7.5%. How good does that look? Whew. Whew. This is such a good beer. Winter ales are a weird breed because they're not a real well-defined category of beer. Anyone can make a winter ale, and all you need is an ale that reminds you of winter or holidays or something like that. And so it's kind of the wild, wild west as far as
beer styles. This one, it's like an orange peel, coriander, and a little bit of, I don't want to say nutmeg, but some kind of like warm spice right on top of it. It reminds me of all the best aspects of a hot toddy in a very, very cold drink. And I don't think that's something that's really easy to pull off. And then the body is this super warm, thick, inviting, cozy, wrap yourself up in a blanket by a fireplace kind of a malt. I know that's a weird descriptor, but a winter ale is supposed to remind you of winter. And this drink absolutely reminds me of winter, sitting in front of a fireplace, curling up with a good book. It's weird how flavors can play with your mind and memories and trigger different things. For me, winter ale could not be a more apt description of this beer. It's fantastic. I love this one. I highly recommend it. Cheers.